Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that this video may anger many folks who claim to be proponents of the ancient astronaut theory. However, it is worth noting that such anger will most likely result from two main factors. Factor 1 derives from simple ignorance, and Factor 2 from a certain vested interest in making a profit. We will cover this in more detail shortly. This presentation addresses the return of planet Nibiru, which is also confused with Planet X, Nemesis, and a myriad of other names. Related to the subject of Nibiru, we will discuss primarily two groups that are very active in this area: the doomsdayers/fearmongers and the pop culturalists. The video is actually part 2 of a rather technical treatment covering the subject of Nibiru as translated from the ancient Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian text. Part 1 is an academic-level thesis that describes the ongoing debate related to translations of the word Nibiru, and specifically the errors made by both scholars and laypersons alike. It offers a robust defense of Zecharia Sitchin and is an essential read for anyone wanting in-depth academic-level knowledge on the topic of Nibiru. Indeed, it would be a prerequisite for anyone attempting to debate this subject in full context. You may view and download the Part 1 PDF document at this address shown on the screen, and a link is also provided in the description below. Okay, so here is the disclaimer. This presentation is not designed to disparage or ridicule anyone. We have enough of that already in this field. With that said, some of the factual commentary forthcoming will sound very much like ridicule to a so-called cognitive dissonant, and that simply cannot be helped. A simple fact that contradicts an entire belief system can many times be interpreted as an attack and often generates a knee-jerk reaction, which I strongly suspect will be the case here. This presentation will unapologetically run the risk of being perceived as a debunking video, but to the contrary, its purpose in reality is to prevent debunking by educating at least one of these two groups, the pop culturalists, not to open the door for ridicule in the first place. Let me be clear on this point. No one believes more in the existence of Nibiru than myself. I spend dozens and dozens of hours weekly studying, researching, and progressing the message of the ancient astronaut theory. And yeah, this one is a bit personal for me. It is beyond frustrating to deal with folks who remain willfully ignorant about the subject in which they claim so much interest. And even worse is for someone to use the subject as a cover for fear-mongering and product sales. A simple truth is that a great many who are perverting the subject are not really interested in the theory at all. The primary purpose of this video is to reach those of you that may have a deeper and genuine interest in the theory and hopefully prevent you from being fooled by those folks who profess knowledge in this area, but actually possess very little, if any, at all. It is worth noting before we move into the heart of the matter that this video has been postponed more than once. At first, it was planned to be an academic-level treatment like Part 1. However, after much deliberation, it was decided that because a good portion of the audience may possibly reside in one of the two groups being discussed, that a more straightforward approach will be taken. So, as a result, this video is presented as more of an opinion piece or an editorial, if you will. The history of hysteria. This portion of the presentation will contain an analysis of the doomsdayers and fearmongers. But before discussing them directly, let's undertake a little history review. Doing so will greatly enhance your perspective and understanding of the full context. Why? Well, because this part is basically about psychology. And it has been said that the study of history is a lot like the study of human psychology over a certain period of time. Portions of the human race have been preoccupied with the end of the world long before the 20th and 21st centuries. There are well over 200 examples of prophecy where mankind meets its end beginning as far back as 53 AD, and likely even earlier. We will speed up and take a look at the first widespread phenomenon in the year 999 AD. This year goes down as one of the most heightened periods of hysteria over the return of Christ. All members of society seemed affected by the prediction that Jesus was coming back at the start of the new millennium. None of the events required by the Bible were transpiring at the time. The magic of the number 1000 was the sole reason for the expectation. During the concluding months of 999 AD, everyone was on his best behavior. Worldly goods were sold and given to the poor, swarms of pilgrims headed east to meet the Lord of Jerusalem, buildings went unrepaired, crops were left unplanted, and criminals were set free from jails. When the year 999 AD turned into 1000 AD, nothing happened. So let's pick up at the beginning of the 19th century and briefly touch on the more famous predictions. The Millerites, April 23, 1843. A New England farmer named William Miller, after several years of very careful study of his Bible, concluded that God's chosen time to destroy the world could be divined from a strict literal interpretation of Scripture. As he explained to anyone who would listen, the world would end sometime between March 21, 1843 and March 21, 1844. He preached and published enough to eventually lead thousands of followers, known as Millerites, who decided that the actual date was April 23, 1843. Both April 23, 1843 and March 21, 1844 passed without incident. Mormon Armageddon, 1891 or earlier. Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church, called a meeting of his church leaders in February of 1835 to tell them that he had spoken to God recently, and during their conversation he learned that Jesus would return within the next 56 years, after which the end times would begin promptly. 1891 passed without incident. Halley's Comet, 1910. In 1881, an astronomer discovered through spectral analysis that comet tails include a deadly gas called cyanogen, related, as the name implies, to cyanide. This was of only passing interest until someone realized that Earth would pass through the tail of Halley's Comet in 1910. Would everyone on the planet be bathed in deadly toxic gas? That was the speculation reprinted on the front pages of the New York Times and other newspapers, resulting in a widespread panic across the United States and abroad. And of course, 1910 passed without incident. Heaven's Gate, 1997. When Comet Hale-Bopp appeared in 1997, rumors surfaced that an alien spacecraft was following the comet, covered up, of course, by NASA and the astronomical community. Though the claim was refuted by astronomers and could be refuted by anyone with a good telescope, the rumors were publicized on Art Bell's paranormal radio talk show, Coast to Coast AM. These claims inspired a San Diego UFO cult named Heaven's Gate to conclude that the world would end soon. The world did indeed end for 39 of the cult members, who committed suicide on March 26, 1997. Nostradamus, August 1999. The heavily obfuscated and metaphorical writings of Nostradamus have intrigued people for over 400 years. His writings, the accuracy of which relies heavily upon very flexible interpretations, have been translated and retranslated in dozens of different versions. One of the most famous quatrains reads, "The year 1999, 7th month, from the sky will come great king of terror." Many Nostradamus devotees grew concerned that this was the famed prognosticator's vision of Armageddon. Lucky for us, that date came and passed without incident. Y2K, January 1st, 2000. As the last century drew to a close, many people grew concerned that computers might bring about doomsday. The problem, first noted in the early 1970s, was that many computers would not be able to tell the difference between 2000 and 1900 dates. No one was really sure what to do, but many suggested catastrophic problems ranging from vast blackouts to nuclear holocaust. Gun sales jumped and survivalists prepared to live in bunkers, but the new millennium began with only a few glitches. Okay, those are some of the more well-known examples of doomsdayer psychology. So now let's see how it applies to Nibiru and talk about the history of Nibiru's perpetual cataclysm. Perhaps the original and arguably still most infamous hijackers of Nibiru was Nancy Leiter. For various reasons, the archive will quote directly from Wikipedia, which is not a normal occurrence, but appropriate here. Quote, "The idea was first put forward in 1995 by Nancy Leiter, founder of the website Zeta Talk. Leiter describes herself as a contactee with the ability to receive messages from extraterrestrials from the Zeta Reticuli star system through an implant in her brain. She states that she was chosen to warn mankind that the object would sweep through the inner solar system in May 2003, though that date was later postponed, causing Earth to undergo a physical pole shift that would destroy most of humanity. The prediction has subsequently spread beyond Leiter's website and has been embraced by numerous internet doomsday groups, most of which link the event to the 2012 phenomenon. The name Nibiru is derived from the works of the ancient astronaut writer Zecharia Sitchin and his interpretations of Babylonian and Sumerian mythology. He denied any connection between his work and various claims of a coming apocalypse. Okay, so two things here. One, it seems that Leiter was the grandmother of the modern social media contingent of Nibiru doomsdayers. For the last 20 years, this group has predicted one date after another as Nibiru's cataclysmic return. Just as stated in the quote, Leiter's May 2003 date was repeatedly revised, so also are the myriad of dates that pop up in the groups on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and all the other platforms. The second thing is the last sentence of the quote. Anyone who is a genuine proponent of the ancient astronaut theory knows full well that Sitchin did not believe Nibiru was due back anytime soon. A doomsdayer does not pay attention to such pesky facts. So what is behind this seemingly irrepressible need for some humans to believe the sky is always falling? Well, recently, the Archive produced a video on world-renowned astrophysicist Freeman Dyson's analysis of climate change. In the interview, Dyson explained the doomsday phenomenon rather succinctly. He believes there is a kind of collective yearning for apocalyptic doom. Dyson said, quote, "It is true that there's a large community of people who make their money by scaring the public. So money is certainly involved to some extent, but I don't think that's the full explanation. It's like 100 years ago, before World War I, there was this insane craving for doom, which in a way helped cause World War I. People like the poet Rupert Brooke were glorifying war as an escape from the dullness of modern life. There was the feeling we had gone soft and degenerate, and war could be good for us all. That was in the air leading up to World War I, and in some ways it's in the air today." End quote. The first sentence of his quote is the most applicable for our purposes here. People who make their money by scaring the public. Well, those people heavily populate the social media platforms that are supposedly dedicated to the Nibiru subject matter. Let me pause here and make a very important distinction. Survivalists are not the same as doomsdayers. Many folks may be both, but the two are not the same. In the Archive's opinion, it is only common sense to prepare for basic survival over any given period of time. Some prefer to be prepared for days or weeks, whereas others have a much more drawn-out plan. No matter the level of preparedness, it does not make someone a doomsdayer per se. The group that is perverting Sitchin's work for personal gain are the doomsdayers, who are in the business of selling survival merchandise. They intentionally utilize Nibiru-centric groups to post outlandish predictions and just keep changing the dates. Just a few clicks into their profile and one can often find a link to some type of product the person is promoting related to survival. That is, of course, if the person hasn't already just blatantly posted a link to their product directly in the group. So, problem one is that the level of this group's greed relies on the gullibility of the pop culture. Problem two is this extends beyond gullibility and actually induces fear among certain folks. The terms doomsdayer and fearmonger were not casually chosen to describe this group, as both terms get straight to the point. So, what can any particular person do about it? Well, first of all, knowing the full picture can help a lot. The more people who are informed that not only are these predictions and sightings of Nibiru nothing more than rubbish, but they are also inflicting immeasurable harm to the credible pursuit of the ancient astronaut theory, then the more people who will not perpetuate the phenomenon. Second, if you need survival products, find a reputable dealer who does not troll Nibiru and like groups, spamming their wares either publicly or covertly. Showing these vendors that the use of fear-mongering does not edify their offerings may send the biggest message of all. But while the doomsdayers and fearmongers are a detestable parasite in this community, there's an even more dangerous group that is much, much larger: the pop culturalists. What makes these pop culturalists so dangerous, you may ask? Well, basically, they are often the recipients of inaccurate information or outright misinformation. Granted, a large number of pop culturalists are in these groups one day and gone the next, but a large number also stick around a while. It is extremely difficult for these folks to hear a factual and more legitimate argument for Nibiru's existence. On the other hand, what is very loud to these folks is Nibiru's contemporary appearance nearby our planet, which is not the case at all. Amid the fear-mongering on the social platforms, folks are having a very hard time finding the truth of the matter. In order to demonstrate the predicament in which these folks find themselves, the archive was going to present examples of group posts from actual members of the various Nibiru cataclysm groups. After much consideration, the archive decided not to go in that direction. The purpose here is not to personally discredit or ridicule anyone. So generalizations will be used in the presentation of what this particular group actually focuses on. And as you may have guessed, it has nothing to do with the ancient astronaut theory. With the fear of doomsday and impending catastrophe notably already present in most members, their focus is almost laser-like on one category of the subject of Nibiru: visual evidence of it being nearby our planet. Okay, let's think about this very cogently and logically. By the way, if you are listening to this and find yourself identifying with the group that believes Nibiru is in our skies, then you are most encouraged to open your mind long enough to at least hear the following logic. No doubt this group has repeatedly been confronted with so-called visual evidence of Nibiru being nearby, and no doubt many of the members have read the explanations of sundogs and lens flares when it comes to explaining most of the photos ever posted. Indeed, the archive estimates that a minimum of 95% of these photos put up that are claiming to show Nibiru actually fall into the sundog and lens flare categories. However, there are in fact some fascinating images in the extreme minority of posts, but these get lost in the shuffle of the folks who believe they have taken a picture of an intruder planet, on a camera phone no less. A lot of the folks that are adamant about Nibiru being nearby will argue unendingly when it comes to their photos. And rarely, one will even sound very scientific in his or her defense. But science is the last thing being utilized by the vast majority in this group when determining the truth about Nibiru. Forget about the name for right now. The name doesn't matter at the most logical level. Let's just say that any intruder planet is nearby Earth. Does anyone actually believe the current climactic environment that we experience would be normal for such an event? Now, the doomsayers would argue that we are in fact experiencing upheavals in the global climate. This is simply wrong. Some studies suggest we are at our lowest level of natural catastrophes within the last 10 years. Moreover, the current changes in climate, regardless of the level of degradation we assign it, is nothing close to the rapid and cataclysmic changes that would be witnessed if an intruder planet were truly nearby. So let's move to the next observation. If such a huge body were nearby, wouldn't NASA announce it? Many in this pop culture group are also part of an overlapping group of conspiracy theorists. Anytime the word NASA pops up, it seems so does this group. The response of these folks is to categorically declare anything NASA does as part of the cover-up. That includes things that NASA does not do as well. For example, not confirming the presence of any nearby intruder planet. Ironically, they have periodically over the last 5 years spent much time garnering findings that support the existence of Nibiru in our outer solar system. And to anyone that knows Sitchin, the Sumerian tablets, and is a true proponent of ancient astronaut theory, this is the most important thing going on with Nibiru right now. Is NASA covering up things? Well, maybe. But it's the archive's position that any potential cover-up does not include Nibiru being parked in our backyard. Even if you play devil's advocate and say, okay, NASA is covering it up, then you're left with the general public. In that group, you will find a large number of amateur astronomers that have thousands upon thousands of telescopes aimed at innumerable points in the sky. The majority of this group do not call themselves ancient astronaut theory proponents, but do you seriously believe a single one of them would keep it a secret if a planet like Nibiru showed up on our doorstep, much less an entire group across the world? The level of conspiracies that would be necessary to hide the existence of a nearby intruder planet is much deeper than the average doomsdayer contemplates. How one comes to the conclusion that these level of conspiracies are reality and the anomalies in the photographs are not simply sundogs and lens flares defies generally accepted logic. And yes, the archive can fully appreciate the irony that many of the subjects in which it finds credibility are themselves viewed the same way by the mainstream. So why criticize the Nibiru doomsdayers, you may ask? Well, those of us who identify as authentic proponents of the theory have spent the time and effort to research these subjects. Many times there is much more to learn about any given topic which mainstream has either abandoned or ignored. In weighing the pros and cons of logical and even scientific arguments, we have gained a much richer context of our history. Sometimes we find evidence for an alternate explanation, and sometimes we do not. But most importantly, we can defend well-defined positions regarding many components of the theory and provide compelling evidence that is not as easily debunked as a sundog. So, does all this mean there is nothing nearby? Not at all. In fact, it is well recognized who folks believing they see Nibiru many times are confused by some other relatively nearby object, both real and theoretical. Okay, first up we have the well-known Planet X. Leiter drew the name Planet X from the hypothetical planet once searched for by astronomers to account for discrepancies in the orbits of Uranus and Neptune. In 1894, Bostonian astronomer Percival Lowell became convinced that the planets Uranus and Neptune had slight discrepancies in their orbits. He concluded that they were being tugged by the gravity of another, more distant planet, which he called Planet X. However, nearly a century of searching failed to turn up any evidence for such an object. Pluto was initially believed to be Planet X, but was later determined to be too small. The true harm endured here by Nibiru, as inflicted by Leiter, was its mistaken association with Planet X. Okay, next we have Nemesis. Believers in Nibiru have often confused it with Nemesis, a hypothetical star first proposed by physicist Richard A. Muller. In 1984, Muller postulated that mass extinctions were not random, but appeared to occur in the fossil record that ranged from 26 to 34 million years. He attributed this supposed pattern to a heretofore undetected companion to the Sun, either a dim red dwarf or a brown dwarf, lying in an elliptical 26 million year orbit. This object, which he named Nemesis, would once every 26 million years pass through the Oort cloud, the shell of over 1 trillion icy objects believed to be the source of long periods of comets that orbit at thousands of times Pluto's distance from the Sun. Nemesis' gravity would then disturb the comet's orbits and send them into the inner solar system, causing the Earth to be bombarded. However, to date, no direct evidence of Nemesis has been found. Though the idea of Nemesis appears similar to the Nibiru cataclysm, they are in fact very different, as Nemesis, if it existed, would have an elliptical orbit thousands of times longer and would never come near Earth itself. Next up, we have Sedna or Eris. Still others confuse Nibiru with Sedna or Eris, trans-Neptunian objects discovered by Mike Brown in 2003 and 2005 respectively. However, despite having been described as a 10th planet in an early NASA press release, Eris is now classified as a dwarf planet, only slightly more massive than Pluto. Eris has a well-defined orbit that never takes it closer than 5.5 billion kilometers from the Earth. Sedna is slightly smaller than Pluto and never comes closer to Earth than 11.4 billion kilometers. Mike Brown believes the confusion results from both the real Eris and Nibiru having extremely elliptical orbits. Next up we have Comet Eldon. Some associated Nibiru with Comet Elnin, a long-period comet discovered by Russian astronomer Leonid Elnin on December 10, 2010. On October 16, 2011, Elnin made its closest approach to the Earth at a distance of 0.2338 AU, or 34,980,000 kilometers, or 21,730,000 miles, which is slightly closer than the planet Venus. Nevertheless, in the lead-up to its closest approach, claims spread on conspiracy websites concluded that it was on a collision course, that it was as large as Jupiter or even a brown dwarf, and even that the name of the discoverer, Leonid Elnin, was in fact code for Ellie, or an extinction-level event. Although the sizes of comets are difficult to determine without close observation, Comet Elnin is likely to be less than 10 kilometers in diameter. Elnin himself estimates that the comet nucleus is roughly 3 to 4 kilometers in diameter. This would make it millions of times smaller than the supposed Nibiru. Comet hysteria is not uncommon. Attempts have been made to correlate Elnin's alignments with the 2011 Japan earthquake, the 2010 Canterbury earthquake, and the 2010 Chile earthquake. However, even discounting Elnin's tiny size, earthquakes are driven by forces within the Earth and cannot be triggered by the passage of nearby objects. In 2011, Leonid Elnin ran a simulation on his blog in which he increased the mass of the comet to that of a brown dwarf. He demonstrated that its gravity would have caused noticeable changes in the orbit of Saturn years before its arrival in the inner solar system. Finally, there is Comet Ison. On September 21, 2012, the International Scientific Optical Network of Telescopes, ISON, discovered the comet C2012S1, popularly known as Comet Ison. Its orbit was expected to take it within 0.429 AU, or 39,900,000 miles of Earth on December 2, 2013. Nonetheless, believers tied it to the Nibiru cataclysm, claiming it would hit the Earth on that date, or that it would fragment and pieces of it would hit the Earth. Images of the fragments of the comet circulating on the internet were shown to be camera artifacts. On April 30th, 2013, the Hubble Space Telescope took 3 pictures of the comet over the course of 12 hours, which were published as a composite in Hubble's archives. This led to speculation on conspiracy sites that the comet had split into 3 pieces, or even that it was a UFO. After Ison passed perihelion on November 28th, it rapidly began to fade, leaving many to suspect that it had been destroyed as it passed the Sun. While a dim remnant did eventually return around the Sun, it was generally accepted to be a cloud of dust rather than a solid object. On December 2nd, 2013, the CIOC, NASA Comet Ison Observing Campaign, officially announced that Comet Ison had fully disintegrated. As you can see, there are many possibilities out there. And this fact begs the question as to why the archive is adamant about it not being Nibiru. Well, beyond the facts that Nancy Leiter is identified as the originator of this modern doomsday narrative, that sundogs and lens flares are blatantly obvious phenomena, and that the entirety of NASA and the world's amateur astronomers are likely not colluding to hide a planet right above our heads, the archive rests its argument with the man that actually identified Nibiru in the ancient texts and knew more than anyone else about its existence. And of course, that someone is Zecharia Sitchin. Quote, in 1992, Robert Harrington and Tom Van Flandern of the Naval Observatory, working with all the information they had at hand, published their findings and opinion that there is indeed a 10th planet, even calling it an intruder planet. The search was narrowed to the southern skies below the ecliptic. Harrington invited Sitchin, having read his book and translations of the Enuma Elish, to a meeting at his office, and they correlated their current findings with the ancient records. The Recover Enuma Elish document, a history of the formation of our solar system and more, says that at the time when Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Uranus, and Saturn were in place, there was a Uranus-sized planet called Tiamat in orbit between Mars and Jupiter. Earth was not yet in place. A large wandering planet called Nibiru was captured into the system gravitationally, As it passed by the outer planets, it caused the anomalies of their moons, the tilting of Uranus on its side, the dislodging of Pluto from its being a moon of Saturn to its own planetary orbit. Its path bent by the gravitational pull of the large planets. First, its satellites collided with the large planet Tiamat, and on a second orbit through, Nibiru collided with Tiamat, driving the larger part of it into what is now Earth's orbit to recongeal as Earth, dragging its moon with it to become our moon with all its anomalies. The shattered debris of Tiamat's smaller part became the asteroid belt, comets, and meteorites. The gouge of our Pacific basin is awesome testimony to the collisional event. Nibiru settled into a 3,600-year elliptical retrograde orbit around our Sun, coming in through the asteroid belt region between Mars and Jupiter at perigee and swinging far out past Pluto at apogee. Harrington acknowledged that his information agreed with all these details, and the maps they each had drawn of the orbits were almost indistinguishable. The current probable location of Nibiru, estimated by both, was the same. End quote. Sitchin ultimately concluded Nibiru's orbit to be approximately 3,450 years long, and its last appearance in the year range 520 to 560 BCE. Thus, the next appearance looks to be around the year 2900 AD. Of course, that is not as exciting as Nibiru showing up next month or next spring or next fall. Nonetheless, that timeline receives mutual agreement from both an astrophysicist and one of the first scholars to translate the word Nibiru. Considering the sources, the archive chooses to adopt this timeline as well. Harrington and Sitchin did not use photos of sundogs or elaborate conspiracy theories to contemplate and derive the position of Nibiru. They used astrophysics and ancient texts that cooperated one another. In conclusion, the viewer may be wondering why the archive chose to speak up on this matter. Well, maybe if Nancy Leiter had decided to call Planet X Tatooine instead of Nibiru, then the archive would have probably remained silent. Instead, she chose to intentionally co-opt a great man's work and pervert its truth. Leiter became the original hijacker of Nibiru when she first made the connection between Nibiru and her Planet X on her website in 1996. Quote, "Planet X does exist, and it is the 12th planet, one and the same." End quote. So the original perversion was intentional. Out of that has grown 20 years of fear-mongering and ignorance. Granted, that is the archive's opinion. The viewer may be diametrically opposed to that opinion. Even so, the viewer will know why the archive does not condone the perversion of Nibiru into something grossly inaccurate. It does not condone the harm created by those who put forth easily refuted assertions concerning the Nibiru component of the ancient astronaut theory. And finally, it does not condone the use of fear and potential cataclysm for personal gain. This may not be the most exciting or popular position regarding Nibiru, but the archive zealously believes it's the correct one.
Maybe you wish to tell us in a few minutes the nature of those discoveries.
I'd be happy to, and you're absolutely right. And as a matter of fact, the date on here, I was just noticing, is 14 August 1978, which was just about 6 weeks after we discovered the fact that Pluto has a satellite. Once you have a satellite for a planet, you can determine how heavy it is. It turns out Pluto was very much smaller and lighter weight than we had thought, which meant that Pluto has no influence, no appreciable influence on the motions of the planets Uranus and Neptune. At that point, we voiced the hypothesis that this means that there is at least one yet-to-be-discovered planet in the outer reaches of the solar system, and this naturally led directly to you and your interest in what we're doing, and that's when you sent me this book.
You have then postulated the existence or the appearance in some time years ago of a celestial body which you, I think, named in that paper an intruder.
Yes.
Which may have collided with or somehow turned on their side both Uranus and Pluto.
It did a lot more than that, as a matter of fact. In that paper, we hypothesized that this intruder passed very close to Neptune, that it dislodged one of what we then think were many satellites of Neptune, and one of them became the planet Pluto. We actually think Pluto was an escaped satellite of Neptune. This will also take the orbit of Triton, the big satellite of Neptune, and reverse it. We'll take the orbit of the satellite Nereid and extend it outwards. We can produce all of the observed aspects of the satellite system of Neptune plus Pluto's orbit just with this one single intruding planet. One of the things we did in 1978, having made this prediction that there was an additional planet, 10th or 12th, depending on your point of view, but it's the next one, we sort of put our money where our mouth was, as it were, and we went out and we started looking for this thing. And we've been searching for 12 years for this thing. We've been able to refine the search area somewhat, get it rather narrowed down. We do our predictions based on the observed anomalies in Uranus and Neptune. We actually are currently looking down in the region of Centaurus, which is just south of the constellation Libra, but very close to the area that you've talked about.
I think, Dr. Harrington, you have a pretty good picture, at least in your own mind, of what we are talking about, a big planet, a small planet.
Well, if it is in the kind of orbit that we describe here, it would have to be a planet that would have a mass something like 3 to 5 times the mass of the Earth. This would put it intermediate between the gaseous planets like Uranus and Neptune and the terrestrial planets that we have in the inner part of the solar system. So if this planet turns out to be in a 3,600-year orbit, then its mass will be correspondingly larger. But we're talking about something that's a perfectly reasonable kind of planet. It looks like a good, nice planet, small enough that it's not going to be completely enveloped in gas, so it's perfectly capable of supporting life forms of one kind or another. This one here is a map of the solar system as we know it. The inner planets, this is the orbit of planet Pluto, and this here is the orbit that I have proposed for the 10th planet, and here's where we think it is right about now in its orbit. This is your orbit for the planet, and showing that it would come out of Sagittarius in biblical time, and that once you allow for precession, it would be around into Libra by now.